Have you ever imagined being betrayed, judged, and silenced right in the place where you should find love, support, and acceptance? I know what it's like. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 47 years old, and I never imagined I'd be here, exposing my story to so many people. But I feel the need to share it, because maybe it's yours too. Maybe what I experienced is exactly what you've been through, or what you're still afraid to face. For many years, I believed in the ideal of a perfect family, in marriage as an unbreakable covenant before God, in the church as my safe haven. But what happens when this castle begins to crumble? When the one who swore fidelity breaks their promise, and betrayal invades not only your life, but also your faith? It's a pain that can't be explained in words, an emptiness that seems to drain the breath and even hope from within us. Have you ever experienced this? What I'm about to tell you isn't just about the disappointment of a marriage that ended. It's about the shock of realizing that instead of open arms, I found closed doors. Instead of comfort, I heard judgment. And instead of helping me heal, they told me to keep quiet, as if the shame were mine, not theirs. Can you imagine that feeling? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now may surprise you. Often, when Christian women face betrayal, abandonment, and divorce, the pain comes not only from the loss of the relationship, but also from the wounds left open by the judgment of their own community. And this hurts even more. With every word of accusation, every look of disapproval, it feels like our identity as daughters of God is being ripped away from us. But is this really what He thinks of us? If even Christian artists like Lauren Daigle faced harsh criticism, imagine a simple woman, betrayed and divorced, trying to find her feet in the church. What I discovered on this journey completely changed the way I view faith, forgiveness, and God's true love. And that's exactly what I'm going to open my heart to you about now. Have you ever felt judged, betrayed, or silenced in the place where you should have been most welcome? Me too. And this contradiction has always marked me deeply, because the church was my home, my refuge, the space where I believed I was protected from the world's pain. I believed I would be surrounded by people ready to support me, lift me up on the hardest days, embrace me when I didn't even have the strength to stand. But when I faced the greatest pain of my life, I realized a hidden truth that no one prepared me for. Sometimes, the most painful wounds come not from those outside, but from those within. The moment I discovered the betrayal, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. It was as if my story had been torn in half. But what truly surprised me wasn't just the disappointment within the marriage. It was the impact of realizing that when I sought support, I encountered judgment. The words I heard hurt me more than the betrayal itself. You need to be more patient. You have to forgive. You shouldn't expose this. Each sentence seemed to push me further into silence, as if I were to blame for what happened. And there, I realized the weight of a system that insists on always placing women in the position of bearing the blame, even when they are victims. This experience plunged me into an intense journey of questioning. I wondered, where is the true gospel? The one that liberates, welcomes, and heals? Where is the transformative mindset that Jesus always brought, challenging norms, lifting up the fallen, and giving voice to those who had none? Behind the scenes of faith, there is a reality that is often hidden, the pressure to keep up appearances, the demand to smile while bleeding inside, the silence imposed so as not to embarrass the community. This has a devastating impact on the soul of those who suffer. It was during this process that I began to realize something important. The people who pointed the finger the most were precisely those afraid to face their own weaknesses. It was easier to project responsibility onto myself than to admit that we all have flaws. The judgmental mindset became a wall, and I found myself trapped behind it, trying to find a way out. But in the midst of this chaos, a revelation began to dawn on me. Perhaps God was calling me to see beyond what I had always accepted as normal. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there is something that completely changed the way I see faith, love, and even the decisions I needed to make to stay standing, even when everything seemed lost. If even Lauren Daigle, a woman so used by God, faced heavy criticism simply for remaining true to her authenticity, imagine what happens to a simple Christian who bears the weight of betrayal within her own church. When I heard comments about her, I realized how cruel the judgmental mentality can be. People who have never experienced her pain feel entitled to point fingers, to question her character, to question the truth of her faith. And it was no different for me. The difference is that I wasn't on stage. There weren't crowds applauding me. I was just Emily, 47, trying to survive the chaos of my personal life. But the impact was devastating. The day the truth about my marriage came to light, I not only lost my husband, but I also lost trust in many I considered brothers and sisters in faith. It was as if the masks fell before me. Behind the scenes of religion, I discovered a hidden truth. People aren't always concerned with restoration, but with maintaining a semblance of perfection. The silence they imposed on me wasn't about healing, but about control. They wanted to avoid scandal, to preserve their image, as if I were merely a disposable part within a system that values reputation more than truth. This revelation tore me apart, but it also awakened me. I realized that if I remained silent, I would lose myself. Every disapproving look, every harsh word I heard, pushed me on a journey of transformation. A journey that began not with victory, but with tears, sleepless nights, and prayers stifled by pain. And yet, there was a small flame within me, almost extinguished, but alive. A flame that told me this was not the end, that there was a path beyond this valley. I began to realize that, amidst chaos, we are forced to make decisions that define who we will become. Either we allow ourselves to be imprisoned by the guilt placed upon us, or we choose to believe that there is something greater waiting for us. It was then that I understood that true faith lies not in the eyes of others, but in the voice of God, who insists on reminding us who we truly are. This was the first great revelation that transformed my life, and it was also the beginning of a profound shift in mindset that led me to see love in a way I had never seen before. And as I walked this painful path, I realized my story wasn't just mine. There were other women living the same wounds, facing the same judgment, and needing the same hope. This connection gave me the strength to carry on and showed me that there was much more hidden behind that pain than I could have imagined. It was at that point that I understood that true transformation begins when we have the courage to look at what was broken without running away and allow God to use even the ruins to write something new. And it is precisely in this place of vulnerability and unexpected revelations that my story continues to unfold, revealing layers that, until then, I myself had not had the courage to face. I believed I had found my true love. I married young, in faith, believing it would be forever. As I looked at the altar that day, my heart racing and tears welling in my eyes, I was certain this was the beginning of a perfect, blessed, and solid life. I felt like I was living a dream, the fulfillment of everything I had learned about purpose, commitment, and family. I grew up hearing sermons about how marriage was the greatest expression of God's covenant with humanity, and I surrendered myself to that promise with all my strength. It wasn't just a relationship, it was a pact before heaven and earth. In the early years, everything seemed to fall into place. I dedicated myself to my home, my faith, and my life as an example. I remember how people at church looked to us as if we were a representation of stability and spiritual success. I felt proud, but I also carried a silent responsibility to never let that image crumble. This expectation weighed heavily, but I believed it was part of the process. After all, isn't that what many women learn from an early age? That we need to uphold with strength, prayer, and obedience what we once promised. Over time, the shadows of my life began to reveal a different reality. The small details I'd tried to ignore became clear signs that something wasn't right. The absences multiplied, the silences grew longer, the conversations became superficial, and I, trapped in a mindset that it was my duty to keep everything together, kept quiet. I told myself it was just a phase, that God would restore, that I just needed to pray more and try harder. The transformation I expected never came, but the pressure mounted. Inside me, there was a mixture of hope and fear. Hope that that initial love could be reclaimed. Fear of facing the hidden truth that perhaps nothing was as it seemed. I clung to every small gesture as if it were a sign, But behind the scenes, my heart already knew something was wrong. It's strange how we learn to deceive ourselves so as not to face the impact of a decision that could change everything. I found myself on a journey of self-deception, where believing in the illusion seemed less painful than facing reality head-on. And even when close friends raised doubts, I defended our marriage tooth and nail. I said that every couple goes through difficulties, that it was just a turbulent phase, that true love required sacrifice. Inside, I felt alone, but it was easier to sustain the narrative than to admit that I might be being deceived. And the more I fed this idea, the more I lost myself. Until the moment came when the signs could no longer be ignored. The weight of my own choices, my beliefs, and what I believed to be faith began to collide with the harsh reality knocking at my door. And it was at that point that my life began to transform in ways I could never have imagined. Until the moment came when the signs could no longer be ignored. The weight of my own choices, my beliefs, and what I believed to be faith began to collide with the harsh reality knocking at my door. And it was at that point that my life began to transform in ways I could never have imagined. I realized that sharing this journey wasn't just about me, but about so many other women who carry similar pain and often feel alone along the way. And that's precisely why I decided to open my heart here, because each story has the power to resonate, to break silences, and to show that there is hope even in the stories most marked by pain. If this topic resonates with you, if at some point you saw yourself reflected in each word, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel, not as an automatic gesture, but as part of a community that grows and strengthens with each new story told. Your participation here is what makes this space exist. It's what gives a voice to so many women who need to be heard. And it's also what allows this message to reach those still lost in the midst of their own battles. Leaving a comment about what touched you most or hitting the subscribe button may seem simple, but the impact is enormous. It's like reaching out to someone else who may be experiencing the same thing you once did. And when many hands join together, the weight of the journey becomes lighter. This is how we build together not just a channel, but a space of welcome and true transformation. And as I share this part of my story, I know there is still much more to be revealed, because some truths only reveal themselves when we have the courage to face what was hidden all along. I grew up hearing that marriage was the greatest test of Christian fidelity. I wanted to be an example, someone who would demonstrate in practice what I'd learned as a child, that a woman of faith remains steadfast, secure, and dedicated, regardless of the circumstances. It was as if my identity was directly tied to my ability to provide a perfect home. And deep down, I believed that if I could do this, I would be pleasing God. The pressure was enormous, but I didn't realize how much this weight was shaping me, controlling my decisions, and even robbing me of my voice. Every piece of advice I heard within the community reinforced this mentality. Conversations between women almost always revolved around how to keep their marriages standing, how to keep their husbands from straying, how to prevent the family from causing scandal. I absorbed it all, thinking this was my mission. But this mindset, which seemed so spiritual, began to imprison me without me realizing it. When the first signs of crisis appeared, my reaction wasn't to question, but to strive to be even more perfect. I held myself accountable for every detail, thinking that if I prayed more, if I were more patient, if I showed more love, he would return to the man he'd been in the early years. This relentless pursuit of living up to expectations was wearing down my soul. I smiled in public, but cried alone behind the scenes. The emotional impact was silent, almost invisible, but it corroded me from within. The hidden truth is that, often, this ideal of perfection is not born of God, but of a culture of appearances that insists on placing burdens on us that were never ours. The most painful thing was realizing that, while I struggled to maintain this image, no one seemed to notice the woman who was tearing herself apart inside. I carried with me a constant feeling of inadequacy, as if I were never enough, and with each failed attempt to fix what was already broken, I became more convinced that it was my fault. This cycle of self-blame led me to a place of profound exhaustion, where even prayer, once a refuge, began to feel like another obligation. The journey that should have been one of faith and hope became a prison of seemingly endless demands. It was in this pressure-filled environment that I began to understand how decisions made under external expectations can rob us of our essence. When we live to meet others' expectations, we fail to hear the most important voice, God's, who calls us to freedom. I only realized this after a long time, when the masks I wore began to fall, revealing that the price of maintaining an image is too high. And it was in this confrontation between illusion and reality that my path began to change direction, even though I wasn't yet fully aware of what lay ahead. Over time, I noticed distances, silences, strange attitudes, but I closed my eyes, thinking it was just a phase. Small details began to accumulate, like loose pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to put together. Phone calls interrupted as soon as I entered the room, excuses for being late home, a distracted look that seemed to pass through my presence without really seeing me. I noticed all of this, but the fear of facing the truth was greater than the courage to question it. I told myself that all marriages go through ups and downs, that I needed to be patient, that my role was to support that home with prayer and believe that everything would return to normal. But little by little, that silence that once seemed harmless began to take its toll. The emotional toll was almost invisible, but constant. I felt alone even when I was with someone, and this emptiness was hard to explain. Conversations became superficial, as if we were performing on a stage so no one would see the behind-the-scenes nature of our relationship. And I, trapped in the mindset that image mattered more than actual pain, continued to close my eyes to avoid facing what was before me. There were nights when I found myself noticing every detail, the coldness in their touch, the rush to end a conversation, the lack of sparkle in their eyes. I tried to justify it to myself by saying it was just work fatigue, that these were normal phases for any couple. But deep down, something whispered that there was a hidden truth waiting to be revealed. A woman's heart senses when something has changed, and mine screamed silently, even when I tried to stifle that intuition. With every distant gesture, every poorly delivered apology, I accumulated doubts. But instead of facing them, I immersed myself even more in the effort to appear perfect. I prepared the best meal, kept smiling in front of people, dedicated myself even more to my church commitments, as if all of this could protect me from a reality that insisted on showing itself. But the illusion of normality has an expiration date, and I was about to discover how far a person can carry alone the weight of a life built on silence. It was at this point that I realized my journey was about to cross a line of no return, where every decision would impact not only my future, but how I would see myself and even my faith. Until one day, the truth exploded before me. He had someone else. My world crumbled in seconds, as if all the certainties I'd held had been ripped from me without warning. It wasn't just the pain of discovery, but the shock of seeing before my eyes what, deep down, I'd already feared but hadn't wanted to believe. It was as if life had thrown me against a wall, forcing me to see the hidden truth I'd been avoiding. The impact was so profound that even breathing felt like an effort. I remember the moment everything became clear, the messages on my phone, the apologies that no longer held water, the cold expression on his face when there was finally no denying it. It was like I was watching a movie of my own life, but unable to control the scene, unable to call, cut, and rewind. The floor opened up, and I fell into an emotional abyss that seemed endless. What hurt me most was not just the betrayal itself, but the knowledge that all my effort, all my nights of prayer, all my silence to protect our image had been in vain. It was as if years of dedication had been discarded in exchange for a hidden adventure behind the scenes. I felt deceived not only as a wife, but as a woman, as a person. The feeling of inadequacy returned with a vengeance, telling me that I wasn't enough, that perhaps I had failed at something. The mind creates cruel traps in these moments, and I found myself trapped by thoughts that eroded my self-esteem. However, there was also something even more difficult to deal with: the breach of trust. Trust is the invisible foundation that sustains any relationship, and when it's destroyed, everything becomes unstable. I didn't know who to believe, not even myself. My own intuition, which had warned me for so long, had been stifled by my choice not to see. And this revelation made me question my own ability to discern, to make decisions. It was a double wound, his for having betrayed me, and mine for having ignored the signs. The journey from there was marked by a heavy silence, laden with unanswered questions. I felt lost between anger and sadness, between the desire to confront and the impulse to simply disappear. Behind the scenes of my heart, a battle raged between the instinct to fight and the desire to give up. And even without realizing it at the time, that pain would be the starting point for a transformation that would change not only my view of marriage, but also my own. It was in this abyss that I realized that the fall, however painful it was, still revealed a deeper ground where hidden secrets would begin to come to light. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was the feeling that my identity, my faith, my dignity had been stolen. It was as if someone had ripped from me not only the love I offered, but also my sense of who I was. Betrayal didn't just destroy a marriage, it shook my inner foundations, the very foundations that supported my outlook on life, God, and even myself. I'd look in the mirror and no longer recognize the woman I saw reflected back. It seemed like every glance carried a weight of shame, as if everyone around me could see what I felt inside. The emotional impact was devastating because it surpassed the pain of abandonment. It was as if there had been a rupture between who I believed I was and who I suddenly found myself forced to face. I had always seen myself as a woman of faith, someone who trusted in God's promises. But at that time, faith seemed to have become nothing more than a distant theory. I wondered where the God I invoked every night was, where the answers to so many tearful prayers lay. The silence of heaven seemed to echo the same indifference I felt on this side. There was also the shock of vulnerability. I had dedicated years to a relationship believing I was protected, but I realized that the place that should have been safe had become a battlefield. This revelation shattered me in a way that cannot be explained in words. It was as if my mind and heart were at war. On one side, anger at the betrayal. On the other, a desperate attempt to understand, to seek reasons, to seek some logic amidst the chaos. But the hidden truth is that some things have no rational explanation. This emotional abyss forced me to face decisions I never imagined I'd have to make. How could I continue living when everything I was called into question? How could I rebuild when the ground seemed utterly devastated? It was in this scenario that I understood how much pain has the power to reveal who we truly are. Because when everything around us crumbles, what remains is the deepest core of our identity. And it's there that we realize whether we're merely sustaining an image or whether we have roots capable of holding us upright. Deep within my soul, I knew I was on a journey that would mark me forever. It wasn't just about overcoming betrayal, but about rebuilding the mindset with which I viewed the world. I needed to rediscover who I was without that relationship, without that story that seemed to define my existence. And although at that moment everything was dark, within me slowly grew the certainty that the transformation would begin right there, in the place I least wanted to be. It was this deep dive into pain that opened the way for me to see realities I would never have considered before. And it was in this clash of emotions that my story took an unexpected turn, revealing aspects that would completely change the path I was about to take. Instead of support, I received judgment. They told me, "You need to forgive, you didn't pray enough, you didn't take good care of him." Words fell on me like stones, each one laden with weight and guilt. I sought understanding, but what I found was an invisible court, where everyone seemed entitled to point out flaws that didn't always exist. The place where I believed I would be welcomed became a space of embarrassment, as if I had become a problem to be hidden. There was no consolation, only a veiled demand that I endure in silence and keep up appearances. It was painful to realize that those who preached love, mercy, and compassion, faced with my pain, chose to distance themselves. Behind the scenes of faith, there's a mentality that often prioritizes the institution's reputation over the lives of those who suffer, and I fell victim to this logic. Instead of seeing me as someone in need of care, they saw me as a threat to the ideal of the perfect family that was so highly extolled. The hidden truth is that often a woman isn't judged by her story, but by the image she shatters when her marriage ends. These words echoed in my mind, reinforcing the idea that I was inadequate. I spent sleepless nights trying to understand where I had gone wrong, wondering if I hadn't prayed enough, if I should have endured more, if it was my responsibility to fix something I hadn't destroyed. It was an impossible weight to bear, but I tried, believing that by doing so, I would be honoring God. The psychological impact of this was immense, because little by little I began to doubt even my faith. Was I any less of a Christian for not being able to deal with that pain in silence? Did God see me with the same accusing eyes I encountered in the church hallways? With each meeting, each service, my heart shrank. I felt like I no longer had space, that simply being there exposed me. Silence became my armor, but inside, I was in ruins. It was during this time that I understood how cruel a culture of judgment can be, and, instead of restoring, can push someone even deeper into the pit. What should have been community became isolation, and this feeling of abandonment within my own flock left scars that took a long time to heal. But it was also in this environment of rejection that something began to stir within me. Because when we're forced to face the contempt of those we thought were allies, we're forced to seek strength in unexpected places. And it was precisely in this process that my journey began to reveal new layers, leading me to discoveries I'd never had the courage to face until then. But it was also in this environment of rejection that something began to stir within me. Because when we're forced to face the contempt of those we thought were allies, we're forced to seek strength in unexpected places. And in the midst of this silent search, I realized how important it is to create spaces where stories like mine can be heard without judgment, only with acceptance. If this topic resonates with you, if in some way your own wounds connect with what I'm sharing here, I want to ask you to like this video. It may seem like a small gesture, but it's through it that this message reaches more people who may be experiencing the same thing and need to know they're not alone. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more hearts, transforming pain into hope. It's almost as if each like is a way of saying, I understand, I've felt it too, I'm on this journey with you. And it was precisely in this contrast between the judgment I received and the need for support that my journey began to take an unexpected turn, revealing truths that I would never have had the courage to face alone. They asked me not to talk about it, as if the shame were mine, not his. It was as if, suddenly, my pain had become an inconvenient secret that needed to be hushed up so as not to tarnish anyone's image. I still remember the tone with which they asked me for silence, as if it were a favor. To the church, a sacrifice I should offer in the name of the community's peace. But deep down, it was as if they were saying, swallow your pain, carry it alone, because appearances are what matter. This mentality gnawed at me, because I not only felt betrayed by the man I married, but also suffocated by a structure that seemed to protect lies rather than the truth. The impact of this silencing was brutal. Speaking out is a form of healing, but they deprived me of it. They turned my suffering into a shameful secret, as if I were to blame, as if his infidelity reflected some failure of mine. This cruel reversal of responsibility placed me in an even more isolated position. It was like walking down a dark corridor where every door I tried to open was locked behind me. Behind the scenes, people whispered, glanced sideways, silently commented on what I could no longer say out loud. And this lack of voice was, at times, more painful than the betrayal itself. The hidden truth is that when you can't speak, you begin to believe your story is worthless. The mind creates ghosts, invents versions, and the heart loses itself in unanswered questions. I questioned whether I should really keep quiet, whether my truth wasn't important, whether somehow I deserved to be living all this. It was a time when I felt trapped within myself, as if I were a stranger in my own life. But there was something curious about this process. The more they tried to silence me, the stronger the need to break. The silence grew within me. It was like a flame that refused to be extinguished, an insistent voice telling me my story could not be buried. This internal conflict became the beginning of a profound transformation. I realized that the imposed silence was not about protection, but about control. And understanding this was a turning point, because from that moment on, I began to see the hidden power in what they were trying to deny me. It was in this space of suffocation and repressed voices that my journey began to take another direction, unexpectedly revealing the strength I didn't know I had. I felt voiceless, alone. The community I called family had turned its back on me. The void this left was immense, because it wasn't just about losing human support, but also about seeing one of the pillars of my life crumble. For years, the church had been my safe haven, the space where I found purpose and belonging. But suddenly that place had become a hostile territory, filled with eyes that avoided mine and silences that screamed louder than any words. It was as if I had been erased, as if my pain were a nuisance everyone preferred to ignore. This feeling of abandonment plunged me into a whirlwind of thoughts. I wondered how people who preached so much about love could distance themselves at a time when I needed it most. It was a harsh but necessary revelation. Sometimes, the same community that welcomes you can also hurt you. And not because God is like that, but because the I mindset of those who should reflect His love is often trapped in traditions that prefer to preserve images rather than care for people. The impact this had on my soul was devastating. I, already weakened by betrayal, now found myself also rejected by those I swore I could call brothers. Behind the scenes, loneliness weighed heavily. I remember nights when I lay crying, feeling like there was no one with whom I could share my pain. Even prayers seemed to echo in an empty room, unanswered. Unanswered. Human silence mingled with God's silence, and it made me question whether He was even still with me. This was one of the darkest periods of my journey, because it seemed like every door I tried to open closed before me. And yet, something curious was happening at the same time. The more alone I felt, the more I was forced to look inward, to face my own frailties, and to seek a strength I hadn't even known existed. It was in this contrast between abandonment and searching that my mindset began to shift. I realized that even when everyone else turns away, there's a flame that insists on staying lit, and that this flame is proof that there's still life, even in the ruins. This discovery didn't come all at once, but slowly, like putting together the pieces of a seemingly impossible puzzle. Each painful memory became an invitation to reflect on who I truly was, beyond the roles imposed on me. And it was in this process that I understood that abandonment, however cruel, was also opening the way for a transformation I would never have sought of my own free will. And even though at that stage I couldn't see it clearly, that feeling of extreme loneliness was preparing the ground for revelations that would completely change the way I understood my faith and the purpose of my journey. I asked God, why? Was I unworthy of His love? This question echoed within me like a muffled scream, repeated every night when sleep eluded me and tears were my only companion. I stared at the ceiling, hugging my wet pillow, and wondered if God truly saw me, if He still cared, or if I had become invisible even to His eyes. My husband's betrayal was painful enough, but the feeling of divine abandonment seemed unbearable. It was as if my faith had collapsed. What once sustained me now seemed distant, almost inaccessible. I went to church services, but I couldn't sing. The words of the songs seemed to no longer fit my reality. Hearing promises of victory, restoration, and joy hurt me, because I couldn't see any of it happening to me. My mind led me to believe that perhaps I wasn't enough to deserve this care, that perhaps, deep down, God was punishing me for something I didn't even know what it was. This internal conflict became a silent battlefield. On one side, the desire to give up, to abandon everything and live as if none of it mattered anymore. On the other, a small, almost imperceptible spark that still whispered that God hadn't abandoned me. I wavered between these extremes, unable to understand how I could trust someone who seemed to allow me to sink ever deeper. It was a struggle between mind and heart, between pain and hope, between silence and the promise that there was something beyond what I could see. Behind the scenes of my soul, questions that had never been addressed before also arose. Was my faith grounded in God, or merely in the traditions and expectations I'd been taught to follow? Did I believe in a God of love, or in a harsh judge ready to punish me for every failure? These revelations, though painful, paved the way for an unexpected transformation, because by questioning everything, I began to realize how much my mindset needed to be rebuilt. The crisis wasn't just spiritual, but also emotional and even existential. I found myself faced with difficult decisions: continue living trapped in a faith that seemed unanswerable, or seek a truer path, even if it was uncertain. With each tear, with each prayer that seemed to reach the ceiling, I felt a sense of something hidden there, something that still needed to be revealed. It was like walking through a dark valley, but with the intuition that, at some point, the light would shine. And it was exactly at this breaking point that something began to happen, something that would completely change the course of my journey and the way I saw myself before God. There were days when I thought about giving up on everything, even life. It was rock bottom. The pain was so intense that there seemed no way out, as if I were trapped in a dark labyrinth with no ray of light. I felt empty, as if my story had lost its value, as if each step were just another weight to carry. It was like walking in an endless desert, where every memory of betrayal, every word of judgment, and every silence from the church echoed like storms within me. I could see no future, only a present, too heavy to bear. In that state, even the simplest gestures became difficult. Getting out of bed was an effort, eating seemed pointless, talking to anyone was impossible. I isolated myself because I didn't want anyone to see how broken I was. Behind the scenes of my life, I fought silent battles that no one could imagine, and it was in this isolation that my mind began to betray me, creating cruel narratives. You failed as a wife, as a Christian, as a woman. These inner voices were sharp as knives, and with each repetition, they made me believe I no longer had a place in the world. But something curious happened during this process. The deeper I descended into this abyss, the clearer one truth became. I could no longer sustain the illusions that had held me captive for so long. Hitting rock bottom, painful as it was, forced me to face my vulnerability without masks, without justifications, without disguises. I was no longer the perfect woman the community expected, nor the devoted wife who held her marriage together alone. I was just me, broken, but still alive. And this revelation, as simple as it may seem, was the beginning of a transformation. Because when you lose everything you believed was essential, you discover that there's still something inside you that resists. A small spark, but real. It was at that point that I understood that rock bottom wasn't just the end, but also the place where I could rebuild from scratch. The pain was still overwhelming, but at the same time, there was a seed of hope hidden there. It was as if, amidst the rubble of my life, a soft voice kept saying, "It's not over yet." And that voice, even though almost imperceptible, began to guide my steps out of the darkness, revealing that the journey was still far from over and that new chapters were about to be written. But it was precisely in that silence that I heard God's voice. "You are not rejected, you are chosen." These words didn't come like a thunderclap splitting the heavens, nor like a spectacular experience before a crowd. They emerged softly, almost imperceptibly, in the midst of my despair. It was as if, amidst my tears, an invisible presence enveloped me and reminded me that, despite all I had lost, I was still loved. In that moment, I understood something I had never realized so clearly. The voices accusing me were human, but the voice calling me to rise came from a deeper place, from a God who is not intimidated by my failings, nor turns away from my pain. This revelation was like a jolt of light in the darkness. I was still broken, still feeling the weight of betrayal and abandonment, but for the first time in a long time, I felt I wasn't alone. The transformation didn't happen immediately, but it was the beginning of a shift in mindset. I began to understand that my identity wasn't in my broken marriage, nor in the church's criticism, nor even in the guilt I carried. My identity lay in something greater, in a truth no one could steal. I was chosen by God. Behind the scenes of my soul, this revelation began to bring life. I realized that this whole process of pain wasn't meant to annihilate me, but to reveal me. The masks I wore, of the perfect wife, the tireless woman, the exemplary Christian, were being ripped away one by one. It was painful, but necessary, because only when all that fell away could I see who I truly was before God. And the hidden truth, which I couldn't see before, was that He didn't need my performance. He only wanted my heart. From that encounter on, I began to look at my journey differently. The judgmental voices still existed, the stares were still there, but they no longer had the same impact. Because when you discover your true source of worth, external opinions lose their power to define you. I understood that my story, though marked by pain, still carried purpose. And that perhaps it was precisely in my wounds that I found the strength to inspire other women to rise up as well. This shift in perspective brought a kind of freedom I'd never experienced before. It was like a weight lifted off my shoulders, like breathing after a long time underwater. I realized that the decisions I needed to make from then on wouldn't be guided by the fear of disappointing people, but by the conviction that God was with me every step of the way. This didn't mean the pain was gone, but that it no longer controlled me. It became part of my story, not the end of it. And it was in this process of rediscovering the truth that I realized something powerful. It wasn't just about surviving betrayal, but about being transformed by it. Because when lies are exposed, truth gains space. When rejection manifests, divine choice is revealed. When shame tries to silence, grace comes to give voice. This revelation changed everything within me, rekindling the hope that my life still had much to offer. And it was precisely with this new mindset that my journey began to take a new direction, opening space for even deeper revelations that would show me that every broken piece could, indeed, be used for healing. I found women in the Bible who were also judged and abandoned, but who rose again through the power of God. And it was through this immersion in Scripture that I began to see myself in a completely new way. I wasn't alone, nor was I the first to face rejection, betrayal, or abandonment. Women like Hannah, who wept bitterly for years without being understood, like Ruth, who lost everything and yet remained faithful, or like the Samaritan woman, judged for her story, but transformed by her encounter with Jesus. Each of them seemed to whisper to my heart, "If we can rise again, so can you." The power of the word began to shatter the lies I'd been harboring within myself. That sense of failure and unworthiness, which had haunted me like a shadow, began to give way to the eternal truths God had already declared. I read and reread passages about unconditional love, grace, and forgiveness. Words that once seemed distant now became daily nourishment for my soul. It was as if, with each page, God was rebuilding the foundations of my identity. Behind the scenes of my heart, transformation was happening silently but powerfully. I began to realize that my life was not defined by what happened to me, but by how I responded to it. It was at this point that my mindset began to shift. Instead of seeing myself as a victim of a painful story, I began to see myself as a participant in a journey of revelation. The hidden truth that unfolded before me was that even my wounds could become a source of impact and testimony. The Bible not only comforted me, but also challenged me. I understood that it wasn't enough to simply survive that storm. I needed to choose what I would do with it. The word reminded me that the decisions I made from that moment forward would shape not only my future, but also how others would be touched by my story. It was as if God was saying to me, "I don't waste pain. What hurt, you can also be used to heal." And the deeper I delved into the Scriptures, the more revelations emerged. I discovered that true faith isn't limited to a perfect, flawless life, but a real journey, marked by falls and new beginnings. Biblical women I'd previously seen as distant characters now became companions on my journey, living examples that it's possible to rise again, even when all seems lost. Esther's courage in the face of death, the persistence of the woman with the issue of blood who broke through barriers to touch Jesus, Mary's humility in the face of an incomprehensible call. They all showed me that faith is a decision and that each step of trust has the power to change the course of an entire life. This encounter with the Word also exposed the truths I needed to face about myself. I understood that I could no longer continue to uphold images to please people. It was time to live authentically, without fear of judgment, because my story was already being written by the author of life. This revelation brought a freedom I had never experienced before. It was as if the chains that held me bound to the past began to loosen one by one. And it was in this process of reconstruction, fueled by truth, that I realized something even greater. The Bible is not just a book of ancient stories, but a manual for transformation for today. Every word carried impact. Every verse became a living promise. From then on, I no longer read just to seek comfort, but to find direction. And each revelation showed me that I was being prepared for something yet to come, something I couldn't imagine, but which was already quietly taking shape in the background of my journey. It wasn't quick, nor was it easy, but little by little, I understood that my worth wasn't in being a perfect wife, but in being the Father's beloved daughter. This realization didn't come overnight, nor from a magical experience that erased all the pain. It was a long process, full of ups and downs, of days when I believed this truth and others when I once again felt small before the voices that still echoed within and without me. Rebuilding my life required not only faith, but also practical decisions, the courage to face the hidden truth I had avoided for so long. I needed to relearn how to live. The first step was accepting that it was okay to be broken. For a long time, I believed that being a Christian meant showing strength all the time, keeping up appearances, smiling even when everything was shattered. But this only made me a prisoner of an image. Acknowledging my fragility was liberating because it allowed me to surrender to God, not an idealized version of myself, but who I truly was, wounded, tired, without answers. It was in this space of honesty that I began to experience real transformation. The second step was to change my mindset. I no longer wanted to live trying to prove something to others. I learned that every decision I made could be an act of healing or self-destruction. If before I had let fear dictate my choices, now I sought the courage to move toward the life God had for me. Small things began to have an impact, resuming a routine, investing time in myself, rediscovering gifts that had been dormant. It was like learning to walk again after a fall, staggering but determined. In this process, I also realized how important it was to revisit the behind the scenes of my own story. Looking back not to wallow in pain, but to recognize the patterns that had held me back for so long. I understood that part of my journey was marked by a relentless pursuit of approval. And when I realized this, I could finally decide that I no longer wanted to live trapped in this cycle. This revelation was essential because it opened the space for me to accept God's grace, not as a reward for what I did, but as a gift for who I was. Reconstruction also showed me that it was okay to start over from scratch. I was no longer the same woman who entered that marriage full of youthful dreams. The pain had transformed me, but this transformation didn't have to be just destruction. It could also be rebirth. It was with this understanding that I began to realize that each scar carried a story, and that these marks didn't diminish me, but made me stronger, more aware, more truthful. Of course, there were days of relapse, moments when I thought about giving up again, but unlike before, now I knew I could get back up. God's word was my foundation, and the revelations He had given me became anchors in the midst of storms. I no longer needed to hide my weaknesses, because I had discovered that it is precisely in them that His power is perfected. And so, little by little, I began rebuilding not only my life, but also my identity. I was no longer defined by betrayal, nor by the church's judgment, nor by imposed silence. I was defined by the love of a Father who never gave up on me. This journey was not just about survival, but about transformation, because in the end, the true impact lies not only in overcoming pain, but in allowing it to reveal a more authentic and courageous version of who we are. And it was in this ongoing process of rebuilding that I began to envision a different future, full of new possibilities I never could have imagined when I was at rock bottom. Possibilities that would soon begin to become reality in surprising ways, bringing to light chapters that would forever change the course of my journey. Forgiving didn't mean going back. It meant freeing myself from a burden that wasn't mine. This was one of the most difficult and at the same time most liberating revelations of my journey. For a long time, I believed that forgiving meant giving up on justice, pretending nothing had happened, accepting the betrayal as if it hadn't left any scars. But immersed in the pain, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about justifying what they did to me, but about not allowing it to continue to imprison me. It was an act of courage, not weakness. I had to face head-on the hidden truth so often hidden from us. Holding on to resentment is like drinking poison, hoping the other person will die, and that was exactly what consumed me. I harbored resentful thoughts, relived every detail of the betrayal, and mentally repeated speeches I would never have the courage to say out loud. But deep down, this prison was mine alone. He moved on with his life, while I remained bound by invisible chains. That's when I understood that forgiveness was, above all, a gift I needed to give myself. This process wasn't instantaneous. I didn't just wake up one day ready to forgive. It was months of tears, prayers that seemed unanswered, and internal battles where my mind told me he doesn't deserve it. But my heart understood I could no longer carry that burden. I discovered that forgiveness isn't an emotion, it's a decision. And that decision changed the way I viewed not just the betrayal, but my entire journey. Behind the scenes of my soul, forgiveness was like a turning point. When I finally decided to release this debt, something inside me broke. But this time, not in destruction, but in liberation. I felt as if tons of weight had been lifted off my shoulders, as if, for the first time, I could breathe without the suffocating weight of bitterness. It wasn't about forgetting, but about transforming. It wasn't about justifying, but about freeing myself. Forgiving didn't mean opening up space for him to return to my life, but rather closing the door on the control that pain had over me. I understood that forgiving is taking a stand, declaring that my story won't be written solely by what was done to me, but by what I decide to do with it. This shift in mindset gave me the strength to see that I could move forward without carrying chains. And the impact was enormous. Forgiveness paved the way for an even greater transformation. I realized I no longer needed to live as a victim, but could choose to be the protagonist of my journey. Every decision from then on carried a new weight, because it no longer came from a wounded heart, but from a heart willing to start over. This liberation showed me that, behind the wounds, there was a strength I never imagined I had, and that the future could be built on much more solid foundations than I had before. It was during this process that I understood that forgiveness doesn't close the story, but opens space for new chapters, revealing that life can flourish even in terrain that previously seemed completely barren. And it was precisely then that I began to glimpse a new phase, where inner freedom became the foundation for something much greater to come. Today, I tell this story not with pain, but with hope, because I discovered that God writes new chapters. This turning point wasn't like a sudden flash of lightning that changes everything at once. It was like the sunrise, slow, gentle but steady, illuminating every part of my life that had previously been hidden by darkness. I realized that even when I felt alone, abandoned, and rejected, there was an invisible hand sustaining me, guiding every step of my journey to this point of transformation. What was once just a bitter memory began to become a living testimony. The impact of the betrayal, abandonment, and judgment I suffered didn't disappear, but it no longer held me captive. Instead, those experiences became fuel for something greater. I learned that every tear shed, every sleepless night, and every painful silence could become seeds of hope, not just for me, but for other women also facing hidden battles. It was at that moment that I understood that pain doesn't have to be the end, but can be the beginning of a new narrative. Behind the scenes, the change was clear. I was no longer trapped by expectations of being perfect, of maintaining an image, or of living up to expectations. This freedom brought a kind of lightness I had never experienced, and along with it came the clarity that my life had a purpose far greater than surviving the wounds. There were profound revelations happening within me. I was capable of starting over, of rebuilding, of inspiring. The hidden truth that finally revealed itself was that even in the chaos, God was writing something beautiful. This turning point also taught me about mindset, because nothing changes on the outside without a firm decision on the inside. I had to choose to see beyond the pain, choose to believe in the future, choose to move forward even when fear still whispered that I wouldn't make it. Every decision, no matter how small, had an impact. Choosing to get out of bed, choosing to look at myself in the mirror with compassion, choosing not to harbor resentment. These small, daily choices formed the foundation for a lasting transformation. And today, Looking back, I can see the greatness of this process. It wasn't just about overcoming betrayal or facing the church's judgment. It was about discovering who I truly was and the value God had already placed within me. This revelation changed everything: my self-perception, my relationship with faith, and even the way I view life's challenges. Because if in that dark valley I found the strength to carry on, I know that any storm that comes will not be able to destroy me. This turning point didn't erase history, but rather redefined it. It showed me that the past isn't a prison, but part of the journey. And it's precisely this awareness that prepares me for the next steps of the journey, where new doors would begin to open, and I would discover that when God writes new chapters, they are always bigger and more surprising than the ones that were closed. If you've experienced or are experiencing betrayal, judgment, abandonment, know this: you are not alone. For a long time, I believed I was the only one experiencing this pain, that no one could understand the weight of being hurt in the very environment where I most expected support. But over time, I realized that there are many women silently carrying similar stories, hiding tears behind smiles, stifling cries of pain amid prayers. The hidden truth is that this silence doesn't have to continue. There is a space for healing, for transformation, for a new beginning. I say this because I know the impact of feeling invisible, believing your voice doesn't matter, and that your life was defined by someone's mistake. But I want to remind you, your identity is not determined by the betrayal you suffered, nor the criticism you heard. Your journey doesn't end in abandonment, but can take on new meaning when you decide to believe that there is still something greater prepared for you. This revelation changed my mindset and gave me the courage to rise up when all seemed lost. And maybe this is the step you need to take too, to see that even in the midst of pain, God continues to write your story, and the chapters ahead can be much more beautiful than those left behind. If even artists who inspire masses face criticism, who are we not to? But like her, we too can stand firm. When I heard stories of Lauren Daigle being attacked for her choices, her words, even her way of living her faith, something inside me stirred. I thought, if a woman so used by God, with a voice capable of touching millions, could be the target of judgment, then perhaps what I experienced wasn't a personal mistake, but part of a reality many face. The difference isn't the attack, but how we choose to respond to it. The hidden truth is that everyone will, at some point, face criticism, betrayal, or rejection. The impact of this can be devastating if we let external voices dictate who we are. But it was in this parallel with Lauren that I realized the importance of staying connected to my identity in God. It doesn't matter if we're an artist before thousands or an anonymous woman inside a small church. The pain of judgment is real, but so is the opportunity to further strengthen our beliefs. And this comparison isn't meant to diminish us, but to remind us that even behind the scenes in the lives of people who seem to have everything, there are invisible battles. This changes our mindset, because it shows us that the fight isn't just ours. We are part of a great journey of faith, in which each of us faces our own challenges, but we can all find in the same God the strength to carry on. When I look at how she kept going, despite being the target of so many opinions, I find inspiration, not because I want to be like her, but because I recognize that the essence of the journey is the same, deciding to remain steadfast even when everything pushes us to give up. It is in this decision that true transformation lies, and it's precisely at this point that my story takes on even more meaning, because I understood that it's not just about enduring criticism, but about allowing it to reveal the truth about who we really are. And this truth always leads us to a place of purpose, opening doors to chapters that are still being written and that carry within them new revelations for the journey. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories. Together, we can transform pain into testimony. I say this not as a cliché, but as someone who has experienced firsthand the impact of having her voice silenced and then rediscovered. Every time a woman chooses to speak out, to reveal her inner workings, to tell the truths so often, hidden behind smiles, something powerful happens. It's as if the imposed silence is broken, opening space for hope to blossom in places where before there was only despair. And that's why your comment matters, why your participation here isn't just engagement, but part of a real transformation. Because when you write about what touched you most, you give courage to another woman who may not yet have found the strength to speak out. When you share this video, you could be bringing a life-giving word to someone who's at rock bottom, believing there's no way out. And when you subscribe, you're not just following this channel, but becoming part of a community of women who are determined to reframe their stories and not let pain have the last word. What I've experienced has taught me that every decision matters, even the simplest ones. Deciding to believe again, deciding to get up, deciding to look forward even when everything inside you wants to look back. These small choices build a different mindset, a mindset of starting over, of courage, of revelations that take us deeper than we imagine. And it's in this collective movement of so many voices coming together that we realize our journey is not a solitary one, but a shared one. I continue to believe that testimonies like this have the power to break chains, expose hidden truths, and rekindle faith in weary hearts. And I know there's still much to be said, because each story carries with it layers of impact that go far beyond what we can see. This is just one part of a journey that continues, full of chapters yet to be written, where each of us can be reminded that pain is not destiny, but can be the beginning of a greater transformation.